The Whitmore Enterprises annual gala sparkled with the kind of opulence that made Manhattan's elite feel superior to the rest of the world. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over marble floors, while waiters in crisp uniforms glided between clusters of billionaires and their perfectly groomed teenage children. This wasn't just a corporate event, it was a display of power, where business empires were built over champagne and handshakes. Richard Whitmore stood at the center of it all, his silver hair perfectly styled, his custom Italian suit worth more than most people's cars. At 55, he was everything money could buy: successful, influential, and utterly convinced of his own superiority. The wine had been flowing freely, and Richard's usual arrogance had sharpened into something more dangerous, a need to prove his intellectual dominance to the young minds gathered around him. "You see, kids," Richard said, his voice carrying the condescending tone of a man who had never been challenged, "this is why education matters. Why your parents pay for the best schools, the best tutors." He gestured broadly with his wine glass, red liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. "Because knowledge is power, and power." The glass slipped from his fingers, sending Bordeaux splashing across the pristine marble floor like spilled blood. The crimson stain spread slowly, seeping into the polished stone. "Damn it," Richard muttered, not bothering to hide his irritation. "Someone clean this up." From the periphery of the golden circle, a figure moved with quiet efficiency. Grace Thompson appeared as if summoned, carrying a bucket and mop with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned to navigate around the wealthy without disturbing their sense of superiority. At 30, she moved with a dignity that her uniform couldn't diminish: pressed black pants, a simple white shirt, and sensible shoes that had walked miles through office buildings. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, revealing a face that spoke of intelligence carefully hidden behind professional composure. She knelt beside the stain, her movements precise and unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world to clean up other people's messes. Richard's eyes fixed on her with the predatory focus of a man who had found his target. The wine had loosened his tongue and sharpened his cruelty. Here was the perfect opportunity to demonstrate his superiority to these impressionable young minds, at the expense of someone who couldn't fight back. "Actually," Richard said, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation like a blade, "this is perfect timing for a little demonstration." The circle of teenagers shifted uncomfortably, sensing the change in atmosphere. Emily Whitmore, Richard's 17-year-old daughter, felt her stomach clench with a familiar dread. She recognized that tone, the one her father used when he was about to say something that would haunt her with embarrassment for weeks. Richard stepped closer to Grace, who continued cleaning without acknowledgement, her focus entirely on removing every trace of the wine. The teenagers watched in uncomfortable silence as their host positioned himself like a professor before a captive audience. "You see," Richard continued, his words slurring slightly, "education isn't just about memorizing facts. It's about cultural refinement, intellectual sophistication, the kind of breeding that separates the leaders from the—" His eyes fixed on Grace with obvious disdain, "the help." Grace's hands stilled for just a moment, her knuckles tightening around the mop handle. But she didn't look up, didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She simply resumed cleaning, each movement controlled and dignified. Thomas Beckett, standing at the edge of the group, observed the scene with growing distaste. As one of Whitmore Enterprises' largest shareholders, he had attended countless events like this, but Richard's behavior was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The man's arrogance had always been a liability, but tonight it felt particularly toxic. Richard wasn't finished. The wine, the audience, and his own ego had created a perfect storm of cruelty. He wanted to humiliate someone, to prove his intellectual superiority, and Grace had become his unwilling target. "In fact," Richard said, his smile turning predatory, "let me demonstrate exactly what I mean." The challenge. Richard's voice rose above the ambient noise of the gala, commanding attention from nearby conversations. More guests began to drift toward the spectacle, drawn by the magnetic pull of social drama. Emily felt her cheeks burn with anticipatory shame, knowing her father was about to cross a line he wouldn't be able to uncross. "I'll give you all my money if you can translate this," Richard announced, his words carrying across the marble floor with the confidence of a man who had never been wrong about anything. The challenge hung in the air like a threat, and every person within earshot understood the unspoken message: this was about to be a public execution of someone's dignity. Grace's hands stilled on the mop. Slowly, deliberately, she straightened to her full height, her dark eyes finally meeting Richard's gaze. There was no anger in her expression, no hurt or embarrassment, just a calm assessment that seemed to see right through his expensive facade to something much smaller beneath. The circle of teenagers stood frozen, caught between fascination and horror. They had been raised in this world of casual cruelty disguised as sophistication, but something about this moment felt different. More dangerous. Richard cleared his throat dramatically, relishing his moment in the spotlight. He had always prided himself on his classical education, his ability to pepper conversations with Latin phrases that made others feel intellectually inferior. It was one of his favorite weapons, deployed strategically to remind people of their place in the hierarchy. Veritas temporis filia, Richard pronounced with theatrical flair, his pronunciation carrying the American confidence of someone who had learned Latin from expensive tutors but had never bothered to perfect it. Let's see if our scholarly janitor can handle a little classical education. The phrase echoed in the sudden silence, and Richard's smile widened as he waited for the inevitable moment of confusion, the stammered apology, the confirmation of his intellectual superiority. This was how the world worked: those who had access to the best education demonstrated their refinement, while those who cleaned up after them accepted their limitations with appropriate humility. But Grace didn't stammer. She didn't apologize. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if considering not the challenge itself but the man who had issued it. Her silence stretched longer than Richard had expected, and something in her stillness began to make him uncomfortable. The teenagers shifted nervously. Emily closed her eyes, wishing she could disappear entirely. Thomas Beckett leaned forward slightly, his businessman's instincts telling him that something was about to go very wrong for Richard Whitmore. And in that moment of suspended tension, Grace smiled, not the apologetic smile of someone accepting their place, but the gentle, knowing smile of someone who had just been handed an unexpected gift. The silence breaks. The silence in the golden circle had weight to it, pressing down on everyone like the air before a thunderstorm. Richard's confident smile began to waver as Grace continued to study him with those dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to see far more than he was comfortable with. When Grace finally spoke, her voice was soft but carried clearly in the sudden hush. "Veritas filia temporis," she said, her pronunciation crisp and perfect, each syllable shaped with the precision of someone who understood not just the words but their weight. "Truth is the daughter of time." The correction was subtle but unmistakable. Where Richard had mangled the grammar, Grace delivered it flawlessly. Where his accent had been clumsy and Americanized, hers carried the musical precision of classical Latin spoken by someone who understood its elegance. Richard's face went through a series of micro-expressions: confusion, realization, and then the first flush of embarrassment. But Grace wasn't finished. Although, she continued, her tone remaining gentle and conversational, "I should mention that your pronunciation suggests you learned from the Palmer method, which is charming, but not quite accurate. The C in filia should be harder, and the emphasis falls differently when you understand the poetic meter Cicero intended." The words landed like surgical strikes, each one precisely placed to dismantle Richard's facade without raising her voice or showing the slightest sign of aggression. She wasn't attacking him, she was simply correcting him with the patience of a teacher addressing a struggling student. Emily's eyes flew open, a mixture of horror and secret delight crossing her face. She had never seen her father rendered speechless, had never watched his confidence crumble in real time. Part of her felt guilty for the surge of satisfaction that coursed through her, but a larger part was simply amazed that someone had finally called out his intellectual bullying. Thomas Beckett's eyebrows rose imperceptibly. In 30 years of high-stakes business negotiations, he had developed an eye for intelligence, and he was watching a master class unfold. Grace's response wasn't just accurate, it was strategically brilliant, delivering maximum impact with minimum effort. Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The carefully constructed image he had spent decades building, the cultured businessman, the intellectual superior, the man who could put anyone in their place with a classical reference, was dissolving before his eyes. You. Richard stammered, his wine-addled brain struggling to process what had just happened. The teenagers around him began to exchange glances, some smirking openly now that the power dynamic had shifted so dramatically. Grace bent to resume her cleaning, as if the exchange had been nothing more than a pleasant academic discussion. But as she worked, she continued speaking in that same gentle tone. "It's interesting that you chose that particular quote," she said, not looking up from the wine stain that was proving remarkably stubborn. Aulus Gellius used it to suggest that hidden truths eventually surface, no matter how carefully they're concealed. Rather prophetic, wouldn't you say? The implication hung in the air like incense, subtle but unmistakable. Richard felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning, a growing sense that he had just made a terrible mistake, not just in challenging Grace, but in revealing so much about himself in the process. The unraveling. The crowd that had gathered to witness Richard's intellectual superiority display began to shift and murmur. The power dynamic had flipped so completely that several guests were openly snickering at the man who, moments before, had commanded their respect through fear and financial influence. Richard's face flushed deep red, the wine and embarrassment combining into a toxic cocktail that clouded his judgment entirely. He couldn't let this stand. His reputation, his carefully constructed image of intellectual dominance, was crumbling in front of the very people he needed to impress. That's very impressive," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "I'm sure you spent hours memorizing that to impress people at parties. But real education isn't about parlor tricks." "You're absolutely right," Grace interrupted gently, finally looking up from the floor. "Real education is about understanding context, cultural nuances, and the humility to keep learning. For instance, did you know that Cicero himself would have been horrified by your pronunciation? He was quite particular about proper Latin, especially when used to diminish others." The circle of onlookers had grown larger now, drawn by the spectacle of a billionaire being systematically dismantled by his own janitor. Emily watched in fascination as her father, the man who had terrorized her with intellectual intimidation her entire life, struggled to regain control of a situation that had spiraled beyond his comprehension. Thomas Beckett stepped slightly closer, his keen business instincts recognizing a pivotal moment when he saw one. He had been looking for reasons to distance himself from Richard's increasingly toxic behavior, and this public display of cruelty followed by spectacular failure was providing exactly the excuse he needed. "Perhaps," Grace continued, wringing out her mop with practiced efficiency, "we should discuss the philosophical implications of using classical education as a weapon. Marcus Aurelius had some fascinating thoughts on the relationship between knowledge and character. Would you like me to quote him in the original Greek?" The offer was delivered with such gentle sincerity that it took Richard a moment to realize he was being eviscerated. Around him, the teenagers were no longer trying to hide their amusement. Several were recording on their phones, capturing the moment for posterity, and for social media. Richard's carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time. His daughter was looking at him with an expression he had never seen before, not fear or intimidation, but something approaching pity. His business associates were backing away, literally and figuratively, from a man who had just revealed himself to be far smaller than his bank account suggested. But it was Thomas Beckett's expression that should have terrified him most. The older man was watching Richard with the cold calculation of someone reassessing a business relationship and finding it wanting. "I think," Thomas said quietly, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation, we've all learned something valuable tonight." The words were simple, but their implication was clear. This wasn't just embarrassment, this was the beginning of real consequences. The proposition. As the crowd began to disperse, their appetite for drama satisfied by the spectacular reversal they had just witnessed, Thomas Becket remained. He stood patiently while Grace finished cleaning the wine stain, methodically returning the marble floor to its pristine condition. Her movements were unhurried, professional, as if she hadn't just delivered one of the most elegant intellectual takedowns in Manhattan social history. Richard had retreated with his tail between his legs, trailing a group of confused teenagers who were still processing what they had witnessed. Emily lingered longest, catching Grace's eye and mouthing a silent thank you before following her mortified father toward the bar. When Grace finally stood, bucket and mop in hand, Thomas approached with the measured steps of a man who had made his fortune by recognizing talent in unexpected places. "Excuse me, miss," he began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of genuine power, the kind that didn't need to announce itself with loud challenges or cruel demonstrations. "Thompson," Grace replied, meeting his gaze with the same calm composure she had shown throughout the entire ordeal. "Grace Thompson." "Miss Thompson." Thomas reached into his jacket and withdrew an elegant business card, extending it to her with the respect he would show any potential business partner. "I'm Thomas Becket. I wonder if you might have a moment to speak with me tomorrow morning? Say, 10 o'clock at my office?" Grace accepted the card, glancing at it briefly before meeting his eyes again. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on her. She understood that something significant was being offered, though she couldn't yet grasp its full implications. "May I ask what this concerns, Mr. Becket?" she inquired, her voice maintaining the same professional tone she had used throughout the evening. Thomas smiled, the expression of a man who had just discovered an unexpected solution to a long-standing problem. "Let's just say that tonight's demonstration of your capabilities has given me some ideas. Ideas that might be mutually beneficial." Around them, the gala continued its glittering course, but something fundamental had shifted in the social ecosystem of the room. Word of Richard's humiliation was spreading through the crowd like wildfire, accompanied by video footage that would soon make its way across social media platforms. The man who had built his reputation on intellectual intimidation had been exposed as a fraud, and the reverberations would extend far beyond this single evening. Grace nodded, tucking the business card into her pocket with the same careful precision she applied to everything else. "I'll be there, Mr. Becket." "Excellent." Thomas paused, then added quietly, "Miss Thompson, I've been in business for 40 years, and I've learned to recognize exceptional talent when I see it. What I witnessed tonight wasn't just intelligence, it was grace under pressure, strategic thinking, and the kind of character that can't be bought or taught. Those are rare qualities in any setting." As Thomas walked away, Grace stood alone in the vast ballroom, surrounded by the detritus of wealth and privilege. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had come to clean up someone else's mess and ended up exposing the mess that lay beneath the surface of respectability. But she had also been seen. Truly seen. For the first time in months of invisible labor, someone had recognized not just her intelligence but her potential. Tomorrow would bring possibilities she hadn't dared to imagine. The reckoning. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, as if Manhattan itself was reflecting the mood in Richard Whitmore's corner office. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, staring at his phone screen with the expression of a man watching his empire crumble in real time. The video of his humiliation had gone viral overnight, accumulating millions of views and spawning countless memes that turned his moment of intellectual bullying into a global symbol of entitled arrogance meeting its match. His assistant had fielded dozens of calls from reporters wanting comments about the translation challenge, as social media had dubbed it. The New York Post was running a front-page story titled "Billionaire's Latin Lesson Goes Wrong." Forbes was preparing a piece on the dangers of corporate arrogance. The damage wasn't just to his ego, it was threatening the very foundation of his business empire. The phone rang, cutting through his spiral of self-pity like a blade. Richard glanced at the caller ID and felt his blood run cold. Thomas Beckett. One of his largest investors, a man whose financial backing had been crucial to several major deals over the past decade. Thomas, Richard answered, trying to inject confidence into his voice. I hope you're calling about the Santiago project. The numbers look fantastic. Richard. Thomas's voice was cold, carrying the kind of finality that Richard had heard him use when terminating business relationships. We need to talk. Of course, of course. When would be convenient? I have some time this afternoon. No, Richard. We need to talk now. I'm calling to inform you that I'll be withdrawing my investment from Whitmore Enterprises, effective immediately. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He felt the air leave his lungs, felt the world tilt dangerously around him. Thomas, please. Last night was. I had too much wine, made a mistake. Surely that's not grounds for. It's not about the wine, Richard. Thomas's voice was steady, implacable. It's about character. What I witnessed last night wasn't an aberration, it was a revelation. You showed your true nature, and frankly, I can no longer associate my name or my money with that kind of cruelty. Richard scrambled for leverage, for any argument that might change Thomas's mind. You're making a mistake. The returns on your investment have been exceptional. You're letting one moment of poor judgment. One moment? Thomas's laugh was bitter. Richard, I've watched you intimidate employees, belittle subordinates, and use your wealth as a weapon for years. I told myself it was just business, just the way things worked at your level. But last night, watching you try to humiliate that woman for sport, I realized I'd been enabling a bully. The line went quiet except for Richard's ragged breathing. $47 million. That's how much Thomas Beckett had invested in various Whitmore projects. Money that was now walking out the door, taking with it the leverage Richard needed for at least 3 major deals. She's nobody, Thomas. A janitor. You're destroying a partnership worth millions over a janitor. The silence that followed was so complete that Richard wondered if the call had been disconnected. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice carried a disgust that made Richard's skin crawl. And there it is, Thomas said quietly. The heart of the problem. You think someone's worth is determined by their job title, their bank account, their place in your personal hierarchy. But that nobody displayed more intelligence, dignity, and class in 5 minutes than you've shown in 5 years of partnership. The call ended with a click that echoed in Richard's office like a gunshot. He stared at the dead phone, feeling the foundations of his world shifting beneath him. Thomas Beckett wasn't just an investor, he was a connector, a man whose endorsement opened doors throughout the financial world. His withdrawal wouldn't just cost Richard money, it would cost him credibility, reputation, and access to the kind of deals that kept his empire growing. Outside his window, the city continued its relentless pace, indifferent to his personal catastrophe. But inside his office, Richard Whitmore finally began to understand the true cost of his arrogance. He had spent decades building his fortune by stepping on others, by using his advantages to make others feel small. Last night, for the first time, he had encountered someone who couldn't be diminished, and in trying to cut her down, he had only exposed the poverty of his own character. The truth, as Grace had so elegantly demonstrated, was indeed the daughter of time. And his time was running out. The new beginning. At exactly 10 o'clock, Grace Thompson stood in the marble lobby of the Beckett Financial Building, her reflection multiplied in the polished surfaces that surrounded her. She had traded her cleaning uniform for a simple but elegant navy dress, professional, dignified, and carefully chosen to project competence without arrogance. In her hand, she carried a leather portfolio that contained her transcripts, her aborted doctoral thesis on linguistic anthropology, and letters of recommendation from professors who had once believed she was destined for academic greatness. The elevator carried her to the 42nd floor in whispered silence, delivering her to a reception area that spoke of understated wealth and serious business. Thomas Beckett's assistant, a woman who radiated efficiency and warmth in equal measure, escorted her to a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. Thomas stood as she entered, extending his hand with genuine respect. He had discarded the formal evening wear from the previous night in favor of a charcoal suit that spoke of serious business, but his eyes held the same intelligent assessment that had recognized her potential in a crowd of hundreds. "Miss Thompson, thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." Grace settled into the chair across from his desk, her posture straight but relaxed, hands folded calmly in her lap. She had spent the sleepless night preparing for this moment, researching Thomas Beckett's business empire and trying to imagine what opportunities might await her in this gleaming tower. "I'll be direct," Thomas began, settling back in his chair with the confidence of a man who had spent decades making decisions that moved millions of dollars and changed lives. "What I witnessed last night was remarkable. Not just your linguistic abilities, though those were impressive, but your composure, your strategic thinking, and your ability to maintain dignity under attack." He leaned forward slightly, his expression growing more intense. "I'm about to close deals with partners in Beijing, Frankfurt, and Moscow. These aren't simple transactions, they're complex negotiations involving cultural nuances, linguistic subtleties, and the kind of relationship building that can make or break billion-dollar agreements." Grace felt her heart begin to race, but she kept her expression neutral, professional. "You need someone who can navigate those cultural complexities." "I need someone I can trust," Thomas corrected. "Someone with the intelligence to understand not just what people are saying, but what they mean. Someone with the character to represent my interests with integrity." He paused, studying her face. "Someone who won't be intimidated by power or corrupted by it." The offer hung in the air between them, pregnant with possibilities that Grace had only dreamed of during her long nights of cleaning office buildings and caring for her grandmother. This was more than a job, it was a chance to use her mind, to apply years of abandoned education to work that mattered. The position would involve extensive travel, Thomas continued. "Beijing next month, Frankfurt in the spring, Moscow by summer. You'd be my cultural liaison, my translator, and my advisor on international protocol. The salary would be substantial. More than substantial." He named a figure that made Grace's breath catch. It was more money than she had ever imagined earning, enough to secure her grandmother's care, enough to perhaps return to school, enough to build the kind of life she had given up hope of achieving. "Mr. Beckett," Grace said carefully, "I'm honored by your confidence in me. But I should be honest about my background. I don't have a degree in international business. I've never worked in finance or negotiations. You're a scholar," Thomas interrupted gently. "I did my research this morning. Full scholarship to Columbia, summa cum laude in comparative literature with concentrations in classical languages and cultural anthropology. You were 2 years into a doctoral program in linguistic anthropology before circumstances required you to leave." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes. She had worked so hard to bury that part of her past, to accept that her academic dreams were dead and buried under the weight of family responsibility and financial necessity. "Circumstances that speak to your character, not against it," Thomas continued. "You sacrificed your own ambitions to care for family. That's not a failing, Miss Thompson, it's a testament to your values." Grace sat in silence for a moment, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered. 6 months ago, she had been invisible, cleaning up after people who never bothered to learn her name. Now she was being offered a chance to sit at tables where decisions that shaped the global economy were made. "There's one more thing," Thomas said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "I spoke with Richard Whitmore this morning. Informed him that I was withdrawing my investment from his company. $47 million, walked away because I refused to do business with bullies." The words sent a shock through Grace. She understood the implications. Her moment of dignity had cost Richard Whitmore far more than embarrassment. It had cost him real money, real power, real consequences. "Knowledge doesn't always wear a suit," Thomas said, echoing the sentiment that would soon become a rallying cry across social media platforms. "Sometimes it carries a mop and speaks 4 languages. Sometimes it has the wisdom to know that true strength comes not from tearing others down, but from lifting them up." Grace met his eyes and saw not pity or charity, but recognition. For the first time in years, someone was seeing her not as she appeared to be, but as she truly was. "When do I start?" she asked. Thomas smiled, the expression of a man who had just made an excellent investment. "How does Monday sound?" As Grace left the Beckett building that afternoon, her portfolio replaced by a contract that would change her life, she paused on the sidewalk to look up at the gleaming towers that stretched toward the sky. Somewhere in one of those buildings, Richard Whitmore was probably dealing with the consequences of his cruelty. But Grace found that she felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a quiet determination to prove worthy of the opportunity she had been given. The truth had indeed been the daughter of time. And now, finally, it was her time to rise. In the years that followed, Grace Thompson would become one of the most respected cultural consultants in international business, her name whispered with admiration in boardrooms from Manhattan to Hong Kong. She would complete her doctoral thesis, establish a foundation for academic scholarships for working-class students, and prove that intelligence and dignity could triumph over wealth and arrogance. But it all began with a moment of grace under pressure, a classical Latin phrase, and the courage to speak truth to power, even when power was holding all the cards. Sometimes the most profound victories are won not with weapons or wealth, but with knowledge, dignity, and the quiet strength to stand tall when others try to make you kneel. And sometimes, just sometimes, the janitor is the smartest person in the room.